my fair friends, I'm Ruby Ruse, this is Baby Bunny, and welcome to Fairy Fortunes, where folklore is real, magic is action, and fluffy bunnies represent the power of imagination. So I do hope that you will consider subscribing to this channel so you won't miss any of our magical content. Today, Bunny and I are here to inspire your imagination because I am going to bring you my top 10 list of my most favorite fairy fiction books. I did have a few criteria for this list. Obviously, I actually did have to read the book for it to appear on this list. But in some cases, the books that I mention are a part of a series, and I will confess that some of them I did not finish the entire series. In addition to having to read the book, another criteria, of course, is that the book must feature a fairy character very prominently in the story. And finally, my last criteria is that I based this list largely upon whether or not it featured one of the 16 fairy creatures, actually I should say 15 fairy creatures, that are featured on the Fairy Fortunes Divination system. So let's begin the list with my number 10 selection, which is the Magical Kingdom of Lanover series, written by Terry Brooks. The first book in this series was published in 1986, and it was called Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold. Terry Brooks is still writing, but in the 1980s, he was one of the foremost writers on fairy or fantasy fiction available. I actually found this particular series a little bit off-putting at first because with that title, Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold, I thought that he was making fun of the fairy realm, but that is certainly not the case in these books. This is a completely modern retelling of a very ancient fairy theme of a human going into the realm of fairy and having great and powerful journeys there. The growth of the main character, Ben Holiday, is just amazing. He goes from this very apathetic lawyer to this very classic, heroic fairy tale hero. So I just really love the journey of that character. This book was included on this list, of course, because the Rivermaster bears some resemblance to an Alfar character. The character of Willow represents a fairy princess. Nightshade, who is the main antagonist of the series, represents, I think, both a Callie in some circumstances and a fairy queen in others. And of course, Strabo the dragon is also featured as a recurring character. Moving on to number 10 is the Mary Gentry series by Laurel Hamilton. Now, I just want to make mention that although I do tend to keep my channel fairly family friendly, I did make mention that I do have an adult audience in mind, and that is very, very important to remember with this particular book series. I cannot, in good conscience, recommend this series to anyone under the age of 18 because there are some very adult themes in this book series. The first book, A Kiss of the Shadows, was published in the year 2000, and there are currently 9 books in this particular series. Now, the reason that I feel that it should be reserved for a more adult audience is that it's pretty steamy, this one. But this is just an amazing piece of literature because the plot is full of intrigue and subplots, which you think would just be chaotic, but Hamilton just juggles all of these different themes just beautifully. Not to mention that the main character is Mary Gentry, is both just deliciously flawed, but also incredibly strong. And what's even more impressive about this series is it takes the genre of fairy fiction and blends it, oddly, with like a classic detective thriller. It's really just creative and outstanding. And if you are older, if you are 18 and above, I highly recommend this series. Once again, the main character, Mary Gentry, is a member of the She. The She in Irish folklore, I think, bears a very striking resemblance to the Scandinavian Alfar. In addition to that, there are characters featured of the Slua, which I actually talked a little bit about in my Wild Hunt and Yule Ritual video in my ABCs of Mythology series. And the Slua, in the capacity of this book, bear some correlations to the Scottish redcap that I feature in my divination system. Number 8 is the Chronicle of Narnia book series written by C.S. Lewis. Now, the first book in this series was actually The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which debuted in 1950. Although what's interesting about that is some modern collections list the first book as The Magician's Nephew, but that book was actually published 5 years later in 1955 as the 6th book in the series. And there are 7 books total in that series. Now, there are a great many Christian themes in this book series because Lewis, at the time that he was writing these books, was very passionate about his Christian religion. But I just have to point out that there are a lot of pagan overtones as well in these stories. And what's very clear about these books is that while C.S. Lewis was very passionate about his religion, his main focus was clearly just telling a remarkable story. The reason that it finds its place on this list is that Mr. Tumnus is a faun, and I think that fauns bear a resemblance to the Russian leshies that are featured in the divination system. In addition to that, the primary antagonist throughout the series, the White Witch, is a perfect example of a Callie. Many of the Irish Callie stories do correlate the Callie with winter, and so she is a perfect representative of that fairy being. Number 7 on the list is the Tiffany Aching books by Terry Pratchett. The first book in the series is called The Wee Free Men, which was published in 2003, and there are 5 books in this series. I was really impressed with Pratchett's description of practical magic in this book. If you are new to magic or are struggling to define it or understand it, I can think of no better way to explain to you what practical magic is by suggesting that you read these books. I just love how he articulated these concepts. The only reason that this particular series is lower on my top 10 list is that I have actually not yet been inspired to complete this series. And why that's significant is that with many of the other series that I have listed on this list, I was so compelled by these stories that I just had no choice but to continue reading the series, and that was just not the case with this particular series for me. Tiffany Achings herself does take on the role of a fairy princess in the Wintersmith novel, which I think is the 3rd book in the series. And then also the goddess Anoia is featured in that same book, and she is the goddess of things that get stuck in drawers. And I just loved her introduction in the story, and she reminds me a great deal of the Penantas characters from ancient Greece. I'd also like to give a shout out to my friend Joshua Safford. Joshua is a performer, magician, and storyteller who focuses primarily on tales regarding the fairy realm. You may actually have seen him perform at your favorite Renaissance fair or fairy festival as he tours throughout the United States. And he was briefly featured in my Bristol Renaissance Adventure vlog, which I will have linked for you down below in the description box. I just wanted to give a shout out to him because he is responsible for recommending to me not only the Mary Gentry series, but the Tiffany Achings stories as well. And I am incredibly grateful for that. So in addition to the video vlog that I have, I also will have a link to his website down below. So I do hope that you will go and check him out. Number 6 on the list is yet another book series. This is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. Now, the first book in this series was Aragon and was originally published in 2001 as a self-published book, but this book was such a success that it was republished by the professional publishing company Knopf Books in 2003, and then they later went on to complete the series, which is a total of 4 books. What's incredible about that 2001 release of this series is that Paolini was only 16 at the time. I really have great admiration for this book. This is a classic example of a modern fairy tale with an epic battle between justice and the opposing force of oppression. It's just wonderful. Elves are prominently featured in this story, and elves, if you're not familiar, are a more modern way to refer to the Alfar. Also, Saphariah the dragon is one of the main characters, but the plot line really revolves around the relationship between elves, humans, and the dragons in this story. And Arya is one of the elves, and she exemplifies again a journey of a fairy princess, and then later in the series she becomes a fairy queen character. Number 5 on the list is a treasury of the world's greatest fairy tales that was adapted by Helen HYMAN, and I actually have my copy right here with Baby Bunny. And what's really sad about this particular collection of classic fairy tales is that this was published in 1972 and unfortunately is currently out of print. This was a copy that I received brand new when it was released. And as you can see, it's in very, very good condition because I have loved this book for the entire time that I've had it. Not only does it just have a beautiful collection of stories, it also is illustrated just beautifully and is just a gem to have. So if you can find this collection at a used bookstore or selling on eBay, I would highly, highly recommend that you pick up a copy of this book. The reason that I've included it particularly on this list is that the tale of Hansel and Gretel, even though it is a German fairy tale, is a perfect example of another Calais. The witch with her candy house is a perfect example of a Calais from Ireland. Another one of my favorite stories that's featured in this collection is The Princess and the Frog, which I think articulates a very powerful transformation process of the fairy princess. Now, you might be thinking that I'm referring to the transformation from the frog to the prince in the story, but really the story is about the transformation that the fairy princess goes through. And in addition to that story, those two stories that I mentioned, there are just a beautiful collection of fairy tales in this book, largely that feature these fairy princess journeys that I'm talking about. Number 4 on the list is The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. This book was published in 1968, and what I found is that people either love this book or they hate this book. There's really not a lot of middle ground with this one. And I'm sure you're shocked to hear that I'm in the camp of people who absolutely adore this book. Not only does this beautiful piece tell the tale of an alicorn, or as it's more commonly referred to, a unicorn, and she is the protagonist, the unicorn actually goes through this magical transformation and for a time becomes a human and has a very transformative journey of a fairy princess. This story is just so beautifully tragic. It's just so sad. And not only will Lady Almathea just break your heart, if you can discover the truth behind King Hadrid's cruelty in this story, you will just weep. It's just so masterful, this tale. Let me know in the comments below if you have read The Last Unicorn and if you are in the camp of those who love it or if you hate this story. I really want to know. Number 3 on the list is the Spiderwick Chronicles book series. And I'm going to look down at my notes for the authors' names because I know I'm going to butcher one of them. This was a collaboration between Tony Deitzler-Zilli and Holly Black. The first book of this series was called The Field Guide, which was published in 2003, and there are 5 books in this series. What I love about these particular books is the research that went into them was just so expertly done. There is just such a wealth of information about fairy creatures in this book, or rather in this series of books. It's also just masterful storytelling, and the characters in the book are just so compelling. You will love these stories. This work features pukas and elves and just so many more creatures from fairyland in them. It's just beautifully done. In addition to those characters, the sylphs in this particular story do bear a striking resemblance to Peri-like creatures. And then also the goblin leader Worm Rat does seem to be giving a nod towards the Scottish red cap because he actually does have a red cap that he wears on his head. And now, let's just bring in a rabbit in the room, shall we? My number 2 on this list may be somewhat controversial for some people. R.K. Rowling, the author, has been in the media as of late, and there's a lot of people that have a lot of mixed feelings about her and then are now affected by their love of the stories, the Harry Potter series that she wrote. So if you can, I would very much urge you to separate the politics of the author, and it's not about whether you agree with her personal belief structures. The reality is that she created a timeless work that speaks volumes to a great many people. The first book in the Harry Potter series, of course, was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, which was published in 1997, with the original title, incidentally, of the Philosopher's Stone. I do believe that if you are in the UK, that it is still called the Philosopher's Stone. If I'm incorrect in that, I do hope that somebody will leave me a comment down below. If you're not familiar with the Harry Potter stories, it really has become a permanent fixture of Western culture. This epic journey, because there are 7 books in this particular series with actual additional spin-offs now as well. These stories teach bravery, they teach wit, resourcefulness, hard work, and if you are a Harry Potter fan, you might notice that those qualities are the primary qualities of the 4 houses of the Harry Potter world. These stories actually make people want to believe in magic, and even if you can't accept it as a possibility, the book just inspires imagination. So as I said, I would really recommend that you, if you do not agree with R.K. Rowling's personal politics, that you just set her aside from the characters that she had a hand in creating. And of course, the reason that it's included on this list, not only is it one of my favorite fairy fiction books, but it includes the character of Firenze, the centaur. He is briefly featured, but he plays an integral part, especially in the Sorcerer's Stone in the first book, and then he reappears later in the series. Also, Fleur Delacour, who is introduced in later on in the series, she is actually has Vila heritage, so that's a very interesting note there. Now, before we get to my number 1 position on this list, I just want to give a shout out to an honorable mention. The Fairy Fortunes Divination system, and if you're not familiar with it, do check the description down below or the cards up above my head, because I will have a playlist that will show you the cards themselves and also give you a taste of some readings that I've done with them. But the Fairy Fortune system also includes the folklore spirits of the Alicanto and the Tengu, both who happen to be bird-like spirits. Now, unfortunately, I have not been able to find a fairy fiction story that features these characters or anything like one of these creatures. So if you know of something that features a Tengu or an Alicanto, I do hope that you will send me a note or leave a comment down below. So I don't have a book that captures these spirits. However, there is a book that I think kind of captures what I feel is the sentiment behind these beings, and that is the Guardian of Ga'Hoole series by Katherine Lasky. The first book, The Capture, was published in 2003, and there are 16 books in this series with additional spin-offs of this book. I tell you, I have actually read all 16 of these books, and they are just charming, and I highly, highly recommend them. The warrior spirits that are featured in this series, they are owls, actually, a wide variety of owls, and so it will, in addition to just giving you an epic adventure, it will actually also introduce you to a wide species of owls that exist in our world. And I do recommend this book if you are interested in fantasy and fairy fiction. I really feel that you will also enjoy the Guardian of Ga'Hoole series by Katherine Lasky. And without further ado, let's get to the number 1 position on my top 10 list of best fairy fiction books. And I'm going to confess that I cheated just a little bit on this number 1 position because it's actually held by 2 books. And those books are J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and his follow-up trilogy, The Lord of the Rings series. Now, many people assume that The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy are one whole series. But The Hobbit was published in 1937, and Tolkien really meant for it to be a standalone work. In fact, I believe he is reported as saying that he had said all that he thought there was to say of hobbits. But The Hobbit enjoyed so much critical acclaim that he was encouraged to expand upon the tale, and in 1954 he released The Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first in the series of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. These books and the fantastical journeys of all of the characters featured, I feel, really defined the whole fantasy and fairy fiction genres. They are just timeless tales that countless generations have enjoyed and will continue to enjoy for years to come. And of course, the fairy creatures that are featured, there are many, but the ones, of course, important for the sake of this list, it features a dragon. Of course, Smaug the dragon is one of the main antagonists of the Hobbit tales. We also have elves featured. First to show up is in The Hobbit with Elrond, and then in the later books, Legolas is a primary character. But my personal favorite character is, of course, Galadriel, who is a beautiful example of a fairy queen character. So that does conclude my list. If I have not talked about your favorite fairy fiction book, I do hope that you will leave that for me in the comments below. It could be that I just have not read your favorite, and I definitely want to read it. So please share that with me in the comments below. And if you disagree with my list, I invite you to tell me all about it in the comments. And with that, have a magical day.